Chains rattled in the dark silence of Christmas night, 1836. Inside a Louisiana plantation, a slave who had endured 15 years of torment stared at the feast his master enjoyed by candlelight. Laughter filled the grand hall while scars burned across his back. But in the shadows, he carried a secret vial. What he poured into the master's wine would forever change the night from celebration to horror. This was not just survival, it was revenge. And it began with poison. The year was 1821 when Samuel's life was ripped apart forever. He was only 12 years old when chains first clamped around his wrists, when the sound of iron links replaced the warmth of his mother's lullabies. That morning, he had been taken from a small cabin on another plantation in Mississippi, dragged screaming as his mother clutched at him until the overseer's whip cut her down. Samuel remembered the smell of dust, the blur of tears, the feeling of his heart pounding as he was forced into a wagon filled with other children. They were livestock to be sold, faces streaked with terror, each one branded by loss before they could even understand what freedom meant. That wagon carried Samuel to Louisiana, where the land stretched wide with endless fields of cotton and cane. Here stood the Devereaux Plantation, a massive estate run by one of the most feared men in the parish, Master Elias Devereaux. The main house rose like a fortress of wealth, its white-painted columns gleaming under the southern sun. Around it sprawled acres of fertile soil, watered by the Mississippi's breath, and on that soil, men, women, and children labored from dawn until nightfall. Samuel, barely a boy, was thrust into this world of unending toil. His body was still growing, but the overseers showed no mercy. They pushed him into the fields with a sack slung across his shoulder, a heavy burden for hands so small. He bent beneath the scorching sun, fingers bleeding as they plucked sharp cotton bolls, his back aching long before midday. The cries of other children filled the air, yet no sound could stop the whip. Overseers on horseback prowled the rows, their leather lashes ready to strike anyone who slowed. Samuel learned quickly. Hesitation was pain, weakness was punishment, defiance was death. The overseer who watched Samuel most closely was Mr. Grayson. His reputation preceded him, whispered in terror among the cabins at night. Tall, broad-shouldered, and cruel-eyed, Grayson seemed to relish the suffering of the enslaved. He did not whip simply to enforce rules. He whipped to break spirits. One evening, Samuel watched in horror as a boy no older than himself collapsed from exhaustion in the field. Grayson dragged him to the whipping post, each lash tearing screams from his throat until the boy lay limp. By sunrise, the child was gone, his body buried without a marker, his name fading into silence. Samuel never forgot that night, nor the grin on Grayson's face as he wiped blood from his whip. Inside the plantation house, life followed a very different rhythm. Feasts were held beneath chandeliers, tables weighed down with roasted meats, steaming bread, and fine wines imported from France. Mistress Catherine Devereaux, barely older than 20 when Samuel first saw her, moved about the grand hall like a queen. Draped in silk gowns and pearls, her beauty was sharpened by cruelty. She demanded obedience not just from her slaves, but from everyone around her. She would scold Samuel for failing to polish silver until it gleamed, or for tracking the smallest speck of dirt across her spotless floor. Her punishments were not loud and brutal like Grayson's. They were cold, deliberate, designed to humiliate. Samuel once heard her laugh as she ordered a woman scrubbed with lye soap until her skin burned raw, all because a cup of tea had been served too cold. But the true architect of terror was Master Elias Devereaux himself. A man of immense wealth and influence, Elias believed fear was the strongest chain. He enforced his will not only through lash and shackle, but through carefully orchestrated spectacles of pain. On more than one occasion, Samuel and the others were ordered into the main yard at night. There, under the flickering glow of torches, Elias would sit on the porch with his wine while Grayson dragged someone forward for punishments. With every lash, Elias would sip, laugh, and remind them that resistance meant death. To him, these people were not human. They were property, tools, numbers that lined his ledgers. For Samuel, each of these nights carved a deeper scar into his soul. He bore the welts on his back, the bruises on his wrists from iron cuffs, but the true wound was inside. The loss of freedom, the memory of his mother's voice fading further each year. Yet Samuel survived. He learned to move silently, to obey just enough to avoid suspicion, while inside him, a storm brewed. 15 years passed in this prison of cotton and blood. Samuel grew from a thin, trembling boy into a man hardened by suffering. His muscles thickened from endless toil, his skin darkened and scarred beneath the sun. His eyes, once filled with childish fear, now burned with a quiet defiance. He became a figure the others looked to, not for hope of escape, but for the strength to endure another day. Yet Samuel carried something no one else did, a vision that extended beyond survival. Every Christmas, the Devereaux family held a grand feast. Wagons brought delicacies from nearby towns, barrels of rum and wine filled the cellar, and music played long into the night. While Elias and his guests gorged themselves in the candlelit hall, Samuel and the others served at their tables, forced to smile, to bow, to carry trays heavy with meats they would never taste. The smell of roasted goose, spiced pies, and buttered bread lingered in Samuel's nostrils as his own stomach twisted with hunger. Yet it was not the hunger for food that consumed him most, it was hunger for justice. At those feasts, Samuel studied carefully. He watched how Elias drank heavily, goblet after goblet of deep red wine. He noted where the bottles were stored, how the servants carried them, how Mistress Catherine demanded her glass filled but never fully drained it. He observed how the overseers drank until their words slurred and their laughter boomed. And every year, Samuel whispered silently to himself, "One day, this feast will not end with laughter. One day, it will end with fire, with silence, with revenge." In the cabins, Samuel spoke little of his thoughts. But he listened. He heard whispers of escape plans, of revolts crushed before they began. Some slaves dreamed of fleeing north under cover of night. Others dreamed of rising up with stolen tools as weapons. But Samuel's dream was different. He did not want to flee quietly into the night, leaving his master unpunished. He wanted Elias Devereaux to feel what so many had felt under his rule: terror, helplessness, and the slow crawl of death. By 1836, Samuel's plan began to take shape. The seeds of revenge had grown in him for 15 long years, watered by blood, sweat, and tears. He had seen too much, lost too much, endured too much. He no longer believed in mercy, nor did he believe in waiting for freedom to be handed down like a gift. The only freedom he would ever know would be carved from vengeance. And he knew exactly when that chance would come, on Christmas night, when Elias raised his cup to drink. But what Samuel had in mind would not just punish his master. It would set the entire plantation trembling. For on that night, hidden in the shadows of the grand hall, Samuel would take fate into his own hands. And poison would become his weapon. The deeper Samuel sank into the life of bondage, the more he realized that the plantation was not merely a place of labor, it was a theater of cruelty. Every sunrise brought dread, every nightfall carried the echoes of screams. Samuel's body had grown strong, but inside him, the years had created a storm, a rage that no lash could silence. By the mid-1830s, Elias Devereaux had become even more ruthless. His wealth increased as cotton prices soared, and with it grew his appetite for domination. He demanded more from the fields, more from the enslaved, more from Samuel. The overseer, Mr. Grayson, tightened his grip as Elias's enforcer. His whip became a constant presence, cracking through the air like thunder, leaving blood on the earth like rain. Samuel bore the scars of that whip across his back, each welt a reminder of the overseer's delight in pain. There were days when he collapsed under the weight of the cotton sack, his body too weak to move, only for Grayson to drag him by the hair and lash him until he staggered back to work. The overseer had one rule. No one rested until Elias was satisfied. And Elias was never satisfied. But the cruelty did not end in the fields. It followed Samuel into the cabins at night. The plantation's laws were Elias's laws, and he ruled with terror. Families were torn apart when children were sold, mothers begging on their knees while their babies were ripped from their arms. Samuel still heard those cries in his sleep, each one seared into his memory. He remembered one woman, Ruth, who clung so tightly to her child that 3 men had to pry her fingers loose. She screamed until her voice broke, and when the wagon rolled away, she collapsed into the dirt, lifeless though still breathing. That night, she tried to hang herself in the cabin rafters. Samuel cut her down before she could die, but the light in her eyes never returned. Mistress Catherine, meanwhile, added her venom in quieter ways. She prided herself on refinement, yet her cruelty was sharp as a blade. She devised punishments that broke spirits without shedding blood. If a dish was served too cold, she would force the servant to kneel for hours on raw rice until their knees bled. If she suspected a slave of stealing food, she would have them tied outside in the winter night, stripped to their waist until frost bit into their skin. And always, she reminded them, "You are property." For Samuel, these years blurred into an endless rhythm of torment. The sound of chains clinking, the sting of whips, the hollow rumble of empty stomachs. He worked through storms, through sickness, through exhaustion that made his vision swim. Yet beneath the surface, he nurtured a secret. While others prayed for deliverance, Samuel plotted. He did not believe salvation would come from heaven. It would come from his own hands. The cruelty reached its peak one night in 1835. Elias summoned the slaves into the yard for what he called a lesson. One of the field hands, Joseph, had been accused of hiding a small piece of bread. Elias, drunk from his evening wine, ordered Joseph tied to the whipping post. Grayson struck him again and again until the ground was slick with blood. But Elias was not satisfied. He demanded that Joseph be hanged then and there, a spectacle for all to see. Under the glow of lanterns, the rope was thrown over a tree branch. Samuel watched, teeth clenched, as Joseph's body jerked in the air before falling still. Elias raised his goblet, laughing, toasting his own display of power. That image never left Samuel's mind, the master's wine glass glinting in firelight, the overseer's whip dripping crimson, the silence of a friend stolen too soon. From that night on, Samuel's rage no longer simmered. It boiled. He could not wait for freedom. He had to take it. And if he could not escape, then he would make sure his master never lived another Christmas to enjoy his feast. Still, Samuel was cautious. One act of defiance, one careless word, could bring death not only to him but to everyone he cared for in the cabins. So he studied in silence. He memorized the layout of the house, the movements of the cooks, the places where bottles of wine were kept. He listened when merchants arrived, when Elias boasted of the wines he imported from France and Spain. He learned when the feasts began, how the candles were lit, where each guest sat at the table. To the master, Samuel was just another pair of hands pouring drinks. But to Samuel, each drink was an opportunity waiting to be taken. The thought of poison grew inside him like a seed. Subtle, silent, unstoppable. Unlike the lash or the blade, poison needed no strength, no noise. It slipped through unnoticed, turning celebration into chaos. And Samuel knew exactly when it could be done. Christmas night. Every year, Elias and Catherine held their grandest feast on that evening, when the halls glowed with candles and music, when wine flowed until words slurred. If there was ever a moment to strike, it was then. Yet doubt haunted him. He had seen what happened to those caught plotting escape or rebellion. They were burned alive, hanged in front of the cabins, buried without dignity. If Samuel failed, his death would not be quick. And worse, Elias might take his vengeance on the others, on Ruth, on the children, on those too weak to fight back. The risk was enormous, but so was the weight of silence. Each day in the fields only sharpened his resolve. Each lash from Grayson, each command from Catherine, each mocking laugh from Elias made the poison in Samuel's heart stronger than any fear. He carried the memory of Joseph hanging in the torchlight, of Isaiah whipped until he died, of mothers screaming for children lost. Their voices spoke to him in the night, "Do not wait. Make him pay." By December of 1836, Samuel was ready. The feast was being prepared, the halls cleaned, the barrels of wine stacked in the cellar. Samuel felt the chains around his wrists heavier than ever, but he also felt something else: purpose. He had survived 15 years, endured every torment, and now the moment of reckoning drew near. But what Samuel planned to do that Christmas would not simply be rebellion. It would be a message carved into the memory of every man and woman who lived under Elias's rule. A message written not with ink, but with poison. And when that night came, no amount of laughter, no amount of wine, no amount of chains would save Elias Devereaux. The cold winds of December swept across the Louisiana fields, carrying with them both the promise of Christmas and the heavy dread of another year in chains. For the Devereaux family, it was a time of feasting and celebration. For Samuel, it was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when 15 years of torment would twist into something far darker: revenge. Preparations for the Christmas feast began early. Wagons rolled in with barrels of wine, baskets of oranges, sacks of flour, and smoked hams from town. The kitchens bustled with activity, the air thick with the smell of roasting meats and spiced pies. Slaves hurried across the grounds, scrubbing the halls, polishing the silver, stringing garlands of greenery at Mistress Catherine's demand. To Elias, this feast was a symbol of power, a display of wealth and dominance for the neighboring planters who would sit at his table. To Samuel, it was the stage upon which his master's arrogance would crumble. Every moment of preparation, Samuel moved with quiet purpose. He carried trays, washed goblets, stacked barrels, but his eyes were always watching. He studied where the wine was kept, how the bottles were handled, who poured and who drank. He listened to the cooks, who muttered about recipes and spices, never noticing the intensity with which Samuel memorized every detail. He walked the halls at night, hearing Elias laugh about the feast to come, boasting that this year's celebration would outshine them all. But Samuel was not thinking of music or roasted goose. He was thinking of poison. The idea had begun years before, but now it demanded flesh. Among the enslaved, knowledge was passed in whispers, of roots that burned the stomach, of powders that stole breath in silence. Samuel had heard of bitter herbs ground into meals, of powders slipped into water. He had seen animals collapse after eating plants from the swamps. Slowly, quietly, he began to gather what he needed. A few dried leaves hidden in his sack, a pinch of ground seed tucked in cloth, each piece gathered with patience that only years of suffering could teach. He kept his secret close. No one could know, not even those he trusted most. To speak it aloud was to risk discovery, and discovery meant death, not just for him, but for anyone suspected of helping. Samuel bore the burden alone, carrying both his fear and his determination like twin weights. At night, lying on the wooden floor of the cabin, he turned the plan over in his mind again and again, sharpening it like a blade. Still, the fear gnawed at him. What if the poison failed? What if Elias tasted something strange and forced Samuel to drink from the same cup? What if another slave was blamed, dragged to the whipping post, hanged for a crime they did not commit? The thought of Ruth's hollow eyes, of the children in the cabins, of the broken families weighed on him. His act could bring freedom, or it could bring slaughter. But then he remembered Joseph, hanging lifeless from the tree. He remembered Isaiah's body in the dirt, Ruth screaming for her child, the scars across his own back. And he whispered to himself in the darkness, "No more. If I must die, I will not die chained. I will not die silent." The days moved swiftly toward Christmas. Snow rarely touched Louisiana, but the nights grew cold, and frost silvered the fields in the morning light. Samuel worked tirelessly in the house, polishing the silver goblets that would soon hold Elias's wine. As he held one up to the firelight, he saw his own reflection, hollow eyes, scarred skin, lips pressed tight. For a moment, doubt flickered. Then he set the goblet down, steadying his breath. On Christmas Eve, the plantation came alive with frantic energy. Servants scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, candles were prepared for every room, and the air carried the scent of roasting goose. Elias strutted about, barking orders, boasting of the fine wine he would serve. Mistress Catherine, wrapped in a gown of green velvet, inspected every corner, every dish, every servant. And in the shadows, Samuel waited. That night, when the house grew quiet and the guests had not yet arrived, Samuel slipped into the pantry. The barrels of wine stood stacked, their corks sealed tight. His heart pounded as he drew out a small pouch from beneath his shirt. Inside lay the powder he had ground in secret, bitter and deadly, taken from plants whose very name was whispered with caution. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the enormity of what he was about to do. He moved quickly, slipping the powder into a bottle that he knew would be set aside for Elias. He stirred it until it vanished into the dark liquid, silent, invisible. Then he placed the bottle back among the others, aligning it perfectly so no one would notice the difference. He breathed deeply, steadying himself. The deed was done, but the hardest part had yet to come. He had to serve it. On Christmas night, 1836, the Devereux mansion blazed with light. Candles flickered in every window, music drifted from the hall, and laughter rang through the air. Guests arrived in their finest clothes, their boots crunching on gravel as they ascended the steps. Elias welcomed them with booming cheer, Mistress Catherine gloating at his side. The table glittered with silver and crystal, the air heavy with the aroma of roasted meats, buttered bread, and spiced wine. And among them moved Samuel, silent and watchful, chains at his wrists glinting in the candlelight. He carried trays, poured drinks, bowed his head. To the guests, he was invisible, another nameless servant. But in his chest, his heart hammered like a drum. He knew which bottle waited for Elias. He knew which goblet would hold the poison. And he knew that once Elias drank, there would be no turning back. The moment was near. Samuel stood in the hall, the weight of the goblet in his hand, the poisoned wine dark as blood within it. He could hear Elias's laughter booming over the music, see his hand reaching for the drink he expected. Samuel took a breath. This was the turning point, the moment where his 15 years of chains ended, not in silence, not in surrender, but in a single act of defiance. And as he stepped forward to serve the goblet, he knew there was no return. The candles burned low, their flames trembling against the winter air seeping through the cracks of the old Louisiana mansion. The table stretched long beneath the glitter of chandeliers, covered with roasted goose, glazed ham, sweet pies, and goblets waiting to be filled. Laughter filled the hall as the neighboring planters raised their voices in song, clinking glasses, boasting of their wealth and power. The room glowed with warmth, but in the shadows behind them, chains clinked softly as Samuel moved between the guests. To them, he was invisible. A servant. A body without a name. But in his hands he carried a goblet filled with poisoned wine, the weapon he had sharpened not with steel, but with patience and rage. At the head of the table sat Elias Devereux, flushed with drink and arrogance. His voice boomed over the music as he told stories of profit and punishment, delighting his guests with tales of cruelty as though they were jokes. Mistress Catherine sat beside him, her lips curled in a smug smile, her jeweled fingers tapping the table. Around them, Overseers and neighbors joined in the feast, devouring food served by the very hands they kept in chains. Samuel stepped forward, the poisoned goblet heavy in his grasp. His heart pounded so loud he feared it would betray him. He set the goblet before Elias with the same steady bow he had practiced for years. Elias barely looked at him, too consumed with laughter, too confident in his own untouchable power. The master's hand wrapped around the stem of the goblet. The poisoned wine shimmered in the candlelight, dark as blood. For a moment, the world seemed to still. The music dulled, the laughter faded, and Samuel could hear only the rush of his own breath. His entire life, 15 years of chains, scars, hunger, and loss, balanced on the edge of that goblet. Elias raised it. He drank. The first sip was nothing. Elias smacked his lips, muttered about the quality of the wine. He laughed again, raising his goblet to the others. But Samuel watched with burning eyes, knowing that beneath that laughter, death was already creeping through his master's veins. Minutes passed. A flush deepened across Elias's face. He shifted in his seat, loosening his collar. A bead of sweat formed on his brow despite the winter chill. His laughter faltered. A cough escaped his throat, sharp and sudden. The guests looked on with mild amusement, until the coughing grew harsher, ragged, violent. Elias gripped the table, his goblet clattering to the floor as his body convulsed. "Elias?" Catherine's voice wavered, confusion breaking through her composure. The master gasped for air, clutching his chest. His face turned red, then purple. He staggered to his feet, knocking plates and glasses to the ground. The hall erupted in chaos, guests rising, shouting, some calling for water, others for the overseer. Elias wheezed, his body shuddering as though invisible chains dragged him down. He collapsed across the table, the feast spilling around him, wine staining the cloth like blood. Gasps filled the room. Some cried out in fear, others demanded answers. Mistress Catherine screamed, rushing to her husband's side, her velvet gown sweeping through broken plates and spilled food. She shook him, called his name, but Elias's eyes bulged with terror as poison clawed through his body. And Samuel stood in the shadows, silent, watching the master choke on his final breaths. For the first time in 15 years, Elias Devereaux was powerless. His laughter silenced. His cruelty ended. His chains, invisible though they were, had been shattered by the very slave he thought beneath him. But the moment did not end with silence. Fear turned to suspicion, suspicion to rage. Overseer Grayson shoved through the crowd, his face twisted with fury. His eyes darted to the slaves who stood frozen, to the goblets in their hands, to Samuel himself. "It's one of them," he roared, his voice cutting through the panic. "The slaves. They've poisoned him." All eyes turned. Samuel felt the weight of their suspicion, the heat of their anger. He knew the danger, knew that discovery meant torture, hanging, perhaps worse. But in that instant, fear no longer ruled him. For the first time in his life, he stood tall, unbowed, unbroken. Elias Devereaux convulsed once more, then fell still. His goblet lay shattered, the poisoned wine pooling at his feet. The master was dead. The hall erupted. Guests shouted, some backing away in terror, others demanding retribution. Mistress Catherine shrieked, her voice rising above the chaos, calling for vengeance. Grayson drew his whip, its leather uncoiling like a serpent. He turned on the slaves, ready to spill blood in the master's name. But Samuel moved first. He seized a heavy candlestick from the table, its iron base solid in his grip. As Grayson lunged, Samuel swung with all the strength forged in 15 years of toil. The candlestick struck the overseer's jaw with a crack that echoed through the hall. Grayson staggered, blood spraying from his mouth. Before he could recover, Samuel struck again, this time across his temple. The overseer collapsed, the whip slipping from his fingers. The guests gasped. Catherine screamed, and Samuel, chained still at his wrists, stood over the fallen overseer like a warrior risen from the ashes of suffering. The slaves in the room, men and women who had served food, poured wine, scrubbed floors, looked to him with wide eyes. For years they had bent under the weight of cruelty. Now they saw one of their own standing tall, weapon in hand, defying the very men who claimed to own him. Chaos spread like wildfire. Some slaves dropped their trays and fled into the night. Others, emboldened, seized knives from the table, broken bottles, whatever they could grasp. The guests shouted in terror, stumbling back, some racing for the door. Catherine shrieked, ordering them to stop, but her voice carried no weight now. The master was dead. The overseer was broken. Samuel turned to the fireplace, his chest heaving. Flames roared within, bright and hungry. Without hesitation, he seized a burning log and hurled it onto the heavy drapes. The cloth caught instantly, fire leaping upward, smoke billowing into the hall. "The chains end tonight." Samuel's voice boomed, louder than the crack of the whip, louder than the master's laughter ever had. Panic consumed the mansion. Flames spread across the walls, smoke curling toward the ceiling. Guests fled, coughing, tripping over overturned chairs and broken plates. The slaves followed Samuel, some carrying weapons, others dragging chains they refused to wear another night. Mistress Catherine's screams echoed through the chaos as the fire spread. She clutched her husband's lifeless body, sobbing, refusing to let go even as the heat seared the air. But Samuel did not look back. He had given Elias his death. The mistress would suffer the fire. The mansion burned like a beacon against the night sky. Flames licked the white columns, devoured the roof, and sent sparks showering into the dark. The sound of breaking glass, splintering wood, and terrified cries filled the night air. For miles around, neighbors would see the glow and know that the Devereux plantation had fallen, not to time, not to storm, but to the vengeance of those it had sought to crush. Samuel stood outside, chains still clinking at his wrists, watching the inferno consume the house where he had suffered for 15 years. His chest heaved, his body trembling, but his eyes burned with a fire that no master could extinguish. The overseer lay broken inside, the master dead by poison, the mistress screaming as the flames closed in. For the first time, Samuel felt the weight of his chains lessen. They had not yet fallen, but their power over him was gone. And as the flames roared higher, drowning out the cries of the dying, Samuel whispered to himself, "Free." The night air was sharp with smoke, ash drifting like black snow against the Louisiana sky. The mansion that once stood as a monument to power now crackled and collapsed in flames. Wooden beams groaned and splintered, the roof caved inward, and sparks shot upward like fiery spirits breaking free. Samuel stood in the fields, his chest heaving, his chains glinting red in the firelight. Around him, the enslaved men and women of the Devereux plantation huddled together, their eyes wide with both fear and wonder. Some clutched children to their chests. Others held knives and broken bottles. They all watched as the house of their tormentors was reduced to ruin. But Samuel knew this night was not victory. It was the beginning of something even more dangerous. From the distance came the sound of bells, dogs barking, riders shouting. Word of the fire had already spread. Neighbors would come. Militias would be summoned. They would not let this rebellion pass without blood. "Go," Samuel urged, turning to the slaves who looked to him as if he were no longer one of them, but something more, a leader, a symbol. "Into the swamps. Into the woods. Don't wait. Don't look back." Some hesitated, paralyzed by fear of the unknown. For years they had been told that beyond the plantation lay only worse horrors, swamps that swallowed men, hunters who would capture them, starvation in the wild. But Samuel's voice carried the strength of fire itself. "You've lived chained. You've lived beaten. You've lived buried alive in misery. Out there, maybe there's death, but in here, it's certain. Run. At last, they moved. Mothers gathered their children. Men helped the elderly. In small groups, they slipped into the shadows of the cane fields, then vanished toward the swamps where dogs would lose their scent. Samuel remained at the edge of the field, watching them scatter like sparks carried on the wind. Behind him, the plantation collapsed in a shower of flame. Mistress Catherine's screams had long since been drowned by the fire. The overseer's body lay broken in the hall. Elias Devereaux, the master, was ashen memory, his poisoned heart no longer beating. Samuel turned toward the woods. His chains clinked as he walked, but now each sound felt different. Not a mark of bondage, but an echo of what he had survived. He moved quickly, slipping into the cover of trees, the fire's glow fading behind him. The swamp embraced him with its darkness, the air thick with the croak of frogs and the hum of insects. Mud clung to his feet, water rose to his knees, and tangled roots reached like claws from below. But Samuel pressed on, guided not by sight, but by will. Hours passed. The cries of dogs came and went in the distance. The shouts of riders echoed, then faded. The swamp swallowed sound, swallowed fear. At dawn, Samuel rested on a mound of earth, his body aching, his throat raw with thirst. He leaned against a cypress tree and listened as the world awakened, the splash of fish, the call of birds, the slow stir of wind through moss. For the first time in years, there was no whip above him, no master's voice, no overseer's shadow, only silence. But silence was not safety. Samuel knew the hunt would not end. The death of a master, the burning of a plantation, the slaughter of an overseer, these acts would ignite fury across the parish. Posters would be printed, rewards offered, patrols doubled, and any slave suspected of rebellion would face the noose or worse. He had struck a blow, but the war was not finished. As days passed, Samuel hid in the swamps, feeding on roots and small creatures, drinking from streams. His body weakened, but his spirit burned brighter. He thought of the others, those who had escaped with him. Did they make it? Did the children survive? Or had the dogs caught them? He would never know. But he did know this. They had seen the master fall. They had seen the overseer broken. They had seen the mansion burn. And whether they lived or died, the memory of that night would live inside them. A seed of rebellion planted deep. Weeks later, whispers began to spread. Some said a slave had poisoned his master on Christmas night. Some said the overseer was slaughtered, the mistress burned alive. Some said a man named Samuel had escaped into the swamps, his chains still on his wrists, and that he lived still, watching from the shadows. Planters told these stories with rage, as warnings. But among the enslaved, the stories spread like hope. Around campfires, in whispered hymns at night, in the quiet of the fields, they spoke of Samuel, the man who had turned Christmas into a night of vengeance. They said he was a ghost now, haunting the cane fields, breaking chains in the dark. They said no master could sleep soundly, no overseer could raise his whip without remembering the poisoned goblet, the burning house. And Samuel himself? His fate was never written. Some said he was captured, hanged beneath the Spanish moss, his body left as a warning. Others swore he made it north, crossing rivers, hiding in cabins, reaching freedom under a new name. Still others believed he remained in the swamps, unseen but unbroken, the fire of rebellion still burning in his chest. What matters is not whether Samuel lived or died. What matters is that his act, his single, defiant strike, shook the walls of power. It proved that even the strongest chains could break. The Devereaux plantation never rose again. Where the mansion once stood, only blackened earth remained. Travelers would pass the ruins and whisper about the night fire consumed it, about the poisoned master who had laughed too loudly, too arrogantly, on Christmas night of 1836. And somewhere in the echo of those ruins, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the clink of chains falling, the roar of flames, the whispered word of a man tasting freedom for the first time. Free!